we'll dive into the presentation. All right, everyone can still see my screen, right? All right, awesome. Let's go ahead and kick it off. So thank you everyone for joining in today. So the goal of this is DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. I mean, that has just been an incredibly hot topic for the past few years, becoming more and more so as time has gone on. So we're going to talk about how to integrate DEI into our specific work, our workflow, and this environment. And Brand Innovation Lab, how does DEI apply to the work that we do every day? So before we dive into the presentation, I want to just make some introductions and celebrate the people who helped make this possible today. So I am Michael, I'm Senior Art Director here, and I've worked with Amazon for a little over 7 years now. And I've been with Bill for the past 4 years. And we also have Kay here with us today. Kay's an art director for Bill, based in New York with myself as well. In addition, we have Ryan joining us, and Ryan's a producer based in LA currently. So today, the three of us are going to talk to you about how we can integrate DEI into our specific workflow. And the goal of the endemic pods is to integrate these goals within, like I said, our workflow to just kind of facilitate a culture of creativity. And even though this is an endemic goal, this applies globally to the team at large. Doesn't matter what vertical, what pod you're in, because we all have common goals, which is trying to reach a wider audience. And of course, we don't want to be leaving anyone out. So we'll go ahead and dive in. So the presentation today is going to be broken down into 4 parts. And I'm going to be talking about how we can utilize our DEI toolkit the best way possible. And the next part will start with creatives and that point of view, and how we as creatives can integrate our DEI principles into our everyday work. The next part after that, we will show how that comes to life within the use of our production team. After that, we'll close off with Q&A, a brief discussion depending on how much time we have left. And the resources page will also help you expand your knowledge on how to be inclusive, and this page also has great links that I highly recommend you explore. There's so much to learn. There's definitely not a shortage of information, so you can definitely peruse that at your own leisure. And, me as a person with a disability, I am still continuing to learn about others out there, others with a variety of disabilities different than myself, and just other people in general. And of course, I identify as, a white male who does have a disability. And so sometimes people see me signing, right? And that is the language that I use. And I have a team of interpreters that I depend on. Today, we have Priya and Olivia with us today, who are facilitating the communication between me and you. So again, I just want to emphasize that there's just an endless spectrum of people with a variety of backgrounds, lived experiences, identities. It really runs the gamut. So I'm excited to keep going with this. So how do we make this intentional? And also, how does this apply to the work that we do every day? So when it comes to Bill, we strive to launch campaigns that consider the broadest base of customers with a wide range of abilities and identities. So in order for us to do this, we implement a collection of diversity and accessibility standards in our creative, design, and development workflow. So I just want to emphasize that you and us, everyone who's here today in the room, we're all SMEs. When it comes to inclusive campaigns, and we consider the clients that we're working for, our goals, what are Amazon's goals as a whole, the goal is to be very inclusive, right? So for me, like I pointed out, for example, I have with me today a team of interpreters. And everyone out there on the team working at Bill, we all have goals, right? We all want to hire the best, hire and develop the best. And in order to make the campaign more impactful, How do we present to the customers? We're all SMEs. We know what we're talking about, right? Because we come from a place of inclusion, or at least we try to do that. So what our goal is to guide the client in that same streamline of thinking. All right, let me go ahead and jump to the next slide. Bear with me. So when creating the look and feel of a campaign or simply reviewing the assets that a client gives us, make sure that you ask yourselves these types of questions and be sure that you're approaching the work with inclusive intentions. And so my goal for this is for everyone to leave here today with more questions than you came in with. And there's no right or wrong answer when it comes to that. But the intention behind the presentation today is to be more of a thought starter. And I want to encourage you all to be open minded and be inclusive as many perspectives as possible. And when it comes to the toolkit, you'll be able to find that on the wiki. And we'll discuss that momentarily. There's a great toolkit there, and we have kind of our North Star. Definitely read through that. And if there's any questions that come up, those should help you with your creative process as well. All right. So there are 8 questions. Again, these are taken directly from the wiki, and these are geared towards creatives specifically. So first is think about ways to increase representation for underrepresented groups and what that could look like. In addition, have you questioned assumptions on what a family unit should look like in terms of skin tone? Are you including various kinds of family makeups, adoptive children, foster children, children from previous relationships, so on and so forth, families with 2 moms, 2 dads, whatever the case may be? How can you include those types of thinking in your work? Have you asked questions to avoid racial and ethnic bias or cultural appropriation? Fourth, have you considered depictions and talent of varying ages for all roles? And are you treating aging with dignity and respect? Fifth, have you shown that being tech savvy is not necessarily defined by only one generation? Have you considered varying body sizes for hero in addition to supporting roles? Have you been intentional about people with disabilities being portrayed? And are you avoiding tropes that tend to perpetuate stereotypes? And lastly, have you embraced intersectionality? A person is never just one dimensional. Characters and representations should not be one dimensional either. And this is not just a checklist. This is just supposed to be an array of questions that you consider while you go through your typical workflow. Questions to ask yourself, ask your teammate, your peers, and keep these discussion points front of mind. And if you do that, the work will only become more elevated. All right, Kay, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you if you want to chat a little bit about this.
So we're gonna kind of break down all 8 of those questions and like just talk about them briefly. So representation of underrepresented groups is kind of self-explanatory. I remember a time when there was like it was very hard to search on Getty as an art director, at least, and any like platform that is used for stock imagery. There was a time when it was like really hard to look for underrepresented groups in general. And I'm a Black queer woman who's 30 years old. So as an art director at that time, usually, I mean, I was a junior art director, so it was very fresh. I think there was a time when it was just extremely difficult, but these are campaigns from like Nike, and I think the one to the top right, maybe Billy specifically, but like I think that there's again, it's a question to ask ourselves is like just to remember that there are others, and that they should be considered. But I will give the industry that we work in some props or some kudos in that. Like, I think there has been more representation of underrepresented groups. But then just again, like if it is something that you're thinking about constantly, as we do create mood boards or we're looking at talent rep, or thinking about different cultural experiences that folks have, like if these are things that you are not knowledgeable in or you may have questions for, like we're a really collaborative team, and I think that there's always someone who could probably answer your question. So just another note to always think about underrepresented folks and how we could be portraying them in our artwork. And then I think you can roll to the next one, like Michael.
Great. Thank you, Kay. That leads us actually to the second question to ask, which is how can we avoid assumptions and avoid quote unquote what we consider to be normal, which looks different for everyone, right? Is your campaign intended for a specific audience, or are you trying to ensure a wider reach? So identify your campaign goals through the briefing process. And you can use an example of what you see on the screen here, right? So Christmas, for example, um, and how we advertise that holiday looks honestly different, right, from one country to another. And again, if you were to really zoom in on that holiday, at like more of a granular level, you will see it depends, right? If it's from a lower income family compared to a high income family, what that looks like, and how can we represent Christmas in a way that includes everyone who may celebrate it. And of course, Christmas is only one holiday out of many. And so I want you to keep in mind just the spectrum again, the variety of options there are for representation and what quote unquote normal could be. I mean, that's impossible to even demonstrate what normal is. But if you consider socioeconomic styles and define how people do the work that they do, in the past, how do people behave post retirement? And is there a way to present a stereotype and avoid those? If someone comes from a specific part of the country, something to consider.
Yeah, and right off the coattails of that, like avoiding racial and ethnic biases and like cultural appropriation, just like cultural experiences that folks have are things that you things that we think are like stereotypical are things to kind of stay away from. And I'm sure a lot of us have like experienced things like this, not only at work but outside in the world. But I mean, this has been huge in my career, specifically as a Black woman. I've been in some rooms with clients where they had a POV for what a certain group of people should be doing or what they look like. And it was super specific to me because I was that group and it just felt weird and nasty. So I think, again, that was years ago, but like as time progresses, like it's just good to think about how we should just not like just try to err on the side of caution, or if you don't know, always ask. And as art directors, I feel like art anybody that's creative or any just human, it's just good to remember to stay away from like stereotypical things and like really challenge yourself to think about like why you may be thinking a certain way, or like are you presenting any biases in that in your perspective. And as always, if you don't know, just ask. um, but I think you can roll to the next one, Michael.
Okay. That brings us to, I mean, there's an endless spectrum if you need to consider variations within age, right? And age itself is defined as the length of time that a person has lived. And a person's experience socially, culturally, economically, etc., can often be impacted by how young or how old they are. And me, for example, maybe it has nothing to do with me being deaf, but I think about myself and my 20-year-old self versus my 30-year-old self and the decisions that I made then and my things that I found joy in changed over time, right? Which is true for all of us. And so I think it's worth considering that there's a variety of interests, um, careers, partners, all of that can change over time, and it does. And age is a big factor when it comes to, often people don't consider the data and considering different age spectrums. So now my statistic here is 79% of people over 50 don't believe that they're accurately represented in advertising. How can we change that? Okay. And I'll just keep going on this one a little bit is how age relates, to multiple generations of people feeling tech savvy. And, in the past, being tech savvy maybe might have meant knowing your way around Microsoft Office. But today that meaning has evolved and it's more than just knowing the basics of, software and apps. To be tech savvy, you need to be able to close that gap. So if you are tech savvy, you know how to make the tech work for you and not the other way around. This could include, incorporating online task organizers, news feed readers, calendars, email management tools, and productivity software. Not everyone has that same skill set. So I think a great example of this is me compared to my father. So me, I can work my way around a computer pretty well, at least I think I can, compared to my father. He's essentially tech illiterate, right? So he doesn't really understand computers, right? He's less capable to do that type of work. Even, anything he would become overwhelmed with when it comes to computers. But if you set him in front of a car and give him an engine to work on, he can do that no problem. Whereas I'm definitely not the same as him. So even though I may be skilled in computers, he's the opposite of me and he can handle, work his way around any sort of engine work that there may need to be done. So when we're trying to sell a product to a wider audience, we need to know who we're targeting, what kind of products are we trying to sell, and make sure that those campaigns are really the most impactful they can be. And let me go ahead to the next slide.
This one is considering body size for hero and supportive roles. Like, honestly, if I was to be transparent, this is something that I definitely need to work on. Something I could definitely get better at. But one thing that I've noticed is that brands are getting it right. This is from Topicals and also Nike. Um, I think it's just an area that it's I struggled with understanding and identifying and classifying in this, and this is just me being honest with myself. Is like there's some room for improvement, but like again, a shout out to the brands that are actually doing it. Actually, most of the artwork that we use in this throughout this is from campaigns that are actually live, which is a good nod, but definitely something to get better at. And yeah, I don't really have much to say, but I do think that there are some excellent folks out there. Topicals, Nike, Peloton, Billy again. Like I've seen it a lot in the shaving, and the creams, or like even Hims. Ads that I've seen on the transit, like there's room for improvement for sure, but I'm really proud to say that there are folks that are actually executing it pretty well. So with that, toss it to you.
Yeah, I actually want to add one thing to that about this slide. So I love how they have that person like walking a cat instead of a dog, right? I love that. That's a great example of DEI. Like cats are animals that people walk as well, right? People always think, no, you walk your dog, you walk your dog. But I thought this is kind of a cute image to demonstrate DEI in that way. So now we're going to talk about various identities and the way to embrace intersectionality. And this is a topic that I could talk about for a really long time, honestly. So, Kay, why don't you go ahead and start, and then I'll chime in my thoughts after.
I mean, I think I'm still learning a lot about intersectionality as a creative and as a Black woman, with my therapist and trying to dissect it for myself. But I think that from my own personal experience, I never really broke down the different identities that I have and how I bring those to rooms. So I could just, I think it's just overall something that I've learned to be very graceful and empathetic about, like just really understanding our differences and being okay with them, and not judging folks for them. But yeah, I think that that's kind of what I was when I was noodling about the POVs and how I bring this kind of stuff to work is just to continue to be very open minded, And yeah, I think, I mean, art, I can always talk about how the society is kind of paralleling what we do, and how these brands and campaigns are trying to parallel what we do in our everyday world, because I sometimes agree and sometimes I don't. But I think for me as a creative person, just continuing to open my mind and open my span of like different cultural experiences, how folks show up in the world every day when I'm at the coffee shop, like really taking in people. New York is a great place to people watch. Is kind of opening my eyes to things that I never realized, and also helping me see myself more in the work that I put out.
Yeah, I agree about New York. That's spot on. Anytime I go to the office, that's usually my favorite day, right? Just because there's so many people to see and it's impossible to see two of the same type of person. Uh, I feel like there's no place else in the world like New York. I love it so much when it comes to people watching. And speaking of intersectionality, right? Like it's not just one thing, right? It could be age, racial. It really does include people, with disabilities, for example. So me speaking as a white deaf person, right? The language that I use to communicate is American Sign Language. And so one of the biggest misconceptions is that I am able to communicate with another deaf person from anywhere across the world. And that's not true, right? If I met a deaf person from Italy, they have their own language. I have my own language. And even to get even more granular, here in the US, you have deaf plus blank. So, for example, a deaf person in the Black community, they have their own dialect, their own phrasing, their own signs that they use, right? And that is their own, and that's related to Blackness and Black culture. And to me, that's separate from how I communicate in the sense that I communicate as a white deaf individual. So it's just something interesting to talk about. And there's a Gallaudet is the only deaf college in the world. It's based in Washington D.C. But if you were to go there, you would see that there's no definition of what a deaf person is, right? It could be anybody, and everyone has cliques and different groups there. And there are some Black deaf students who it's pretty interesting because they talk a lot about identity. And at Gallaudet, the majority of the students there are white, but the Black students there feel like, no, we're here, and for me, my identity is Black. That's what I lead with. And so when I'm not at school, I'm engaging with the Black community, whereas as a white deaf person, sometimes it may be that your primary identity is white. And so it just goes to show how much intersectionality that there is, whether these people identify as white, gay, straight, transgender. It really could just include anything. And so this is just again one of my favorite topics to discuss. And we're all just a big melting pot, and everyone brings something new to the table. And it's a fascinating concept to consider. A big question to keep in mind is how can you define a campaign without just one second. How can you define a campaign without considering the intersections of identities? So that brings us here to, I believe, the last question. So be intentional when portraying people with disabilities. For example, again, as a deaf individual, I'm considered culturally deaf, but there are people who identify as just medically deaf. So, for example, that means someone who, let's just say, grandma lost her hearing in her 60s. So, grandma and I are both deaf, but are we the same? No, not at all. I don't think that there would be a way for us to necessarily communicate with each other. But again, that applies to a wide spectrum within disabilities, and that can include, size, shape, and there are even invisible disabilities. Like sometimes um, I'll enter a situation where, as you all know, I'm a white male, and I come from a place of privilege, which I recognize. And sometimes I have to shift my perspective and realize that what we really need to do is avoid that sense of, judging a book by its cover. And I know we say that over and over and everyone's heard that, but it is true. And an interesting statistic here is that less than 1% of ads represent people with disabilities, even though a quarter of adults live with a disability. I mean, quite the disconnect there. So now we've talked through the 8 questions to keep considering and how these can be brought to life when it comes to production. That's where the producers come in. So at this point, I will go ahead and turn it over to Ryan. Go ahead and take it away.
Hey, thanks so much, Michael. Yeah, no, this is thanks for kicking it over to me. I think when it comes to production, this is a very important topic, and I think it's something that we're actively trying to get better at as we work with the production companies and we start putting briefs together. But just to dive in, we just want to start with this point is I think one of the most important milestones in this is writing the casting brief because when we engage the production company, it's one of the first things that they ask for. Well, who's going to be in it? What are they, what are the specs? What are the specs? They're constantly hitting us up for that. So I think just it's something DEI is something we want to be mindful of throughout the entire production, but especially at the beginning, we really want to, make sure that we're really including everyone and we're not making anyone feel excluded. And whenever we can incorporate DEI, we should. So we think that's very important. If you want to just go to the next slide. So there's really 4 areas to focus on when it comes to production. So where we can include DEI. So casting is arguably the biggest one, but also storytelling. And another really important area, or 2 important areas, is the production crew, and then the accessibility of final assets. And I guess one thing I just want to mention, just as we kind of kick this off, I had a mentor tell me once, she was a woman of color who's an executive producer and worked very hard to get to the position that she was in. And she told me, she's like, we all watch movies and TV, right? But the average person sees anywhere from like 4,000 to 10,000 ads in a single day, right? So, and it's probably growing now with growing social platforms and the rise of AI and all these things. So we as creatives and producers and solutions managers, like we have a lot of power in what people see, and as a direct result, it impacts how they think and how they view the world. So like Michael just said a minute ago, like the fact that there's only 1% representation, even though it makes up a quarter of the populace is terrible. And I think it's something that we can use these tools, we can learn these methods to change that. So, yeah, if you want to just go to the next slide. So the first one's casting, which we touched upon for a sec, but a couple questions you can ask yourself just while you're putting these specs together is, are we celebrating people of different ages, body types, skin colors, orientations, identities, and disabilities? This is something we really should reflect in the casting specs up front prior to the casting call. But not just that, it's also something, again, we want to keep this in mind as we're going through the casting process. Something that every once in a while you see is you might send something out to a director. It might be full of, DEI initiatives, and you might get something back that isn't up to par with what we had sent out. And it's okay to call them out on that. It's okay to be like, hey, we need more DEI inclusion in here. And so, yeah, that's something we just want to keep in mind as we move forward. If you want to go to the next slide. So with storytelling, this one's really important as well. So, we sell to all different kinds of people, marketing to all different parts of the world, all different, groups. So it's really important when we're crafting these stories to make sure everyone's feeling included. We don't want anyone to feel excluded or misrepresented. And so there's some questions here that we can ask as well when we're crafting the creative. So, is there a diverse character in a primary role, speaking role versus background? Can the story content portray the DEI protagonist in an authentic way? If the protagonist is not DEI, can there be a diverse character in a position of empowerment featured elsewhere in the content? That could be a supporting character, maybe some of the background extras, are a little more inclusive. Does the content community a variety of cultural experiences relevant to the audience? This can include highlighting different environments, whether it's rural or urban, and also just representing people from different socioeconomical backgrounds. So, and then the final thing I would say is just, are there any cultural appropriation watchouts? I think this one's especially important. We've seen plenty of ads over the years where clearly brands are trying to target a specific group, and they fail because clearly the people operating behind the scenes weren't diverse enough. And so it's important to have people operating not just in the commercial but also behind the camera as well, which sort of takes us into our next slide. If you go to the next one after storytelling. Yep, so the production crew. So we want to make sure that all the production partners are aware of this collective responsibility to engage a group of talent, not just in front of the camera, but also behind the camera, and behind the scenes, that represents our broad spectrum of global customers, with a diverse range of backgrounds, including, among other things, the basis of gender, ethnicity, age, sexual orientation, physical characteristics, abilities, family structures, lifestyles. We really work closely with these production partners, and we always tell them at the upfront, like, we really should have as diverse a talent pool as possible. There's tons of talented DEI directors, DPs, gaffers, everybody, and it's for a very long time they were not included in these productions. So that's something that we're actively working to change. And it's actually something that we put in the production contracts now, and in the scope of work as well, as we will tell them, hey, whenever possible, you need to include more diversity in DEI. And then another thing that's interesting that we tend to try to do whenever we can is, if the budget allows it, you can allow one crew person to be doubled. It's called double the line. Hashtag double the line is, you can see it on Twitter. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's basically, if we need an extra, or if we can double one of the crew positions on set, and we hire someone with a diverse background or DEI, and just to create opportunities, and also gives us that unique perspective as well. So it's a very cool initiative that a lot of producers are doing now. If you want to just jump to the next slide. And just to wrap it up, there's the final piece is accessibility of the final assets. So as you can see here, we have a screenshot with subtitles being added. It's really not hard to add subtitles to things now. It's especially with, like, auto generation. It's incredibly easy, and it's something that we now tell the production partners we really want to include a subtitled version when we export. Another thing that's worth mentioning, and your producer would know this, is we tend to ask for VTT files as well, and those are web text files that we like to include sometimes in the packaging, so that way when you go to post it on social or whatever, it's basically just gives you that generated text that you find on a lot of social videos. So, but yeah, there's tons of we're looking into tons of ways to make things more accessible to everybody, because if you're going to make content for everybody, we should make sure that everyone is able to see it. So yeah, that's the end of that slide. But yeah, if anybody has any questions, or I'll kick it back over to Michael.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. Even for me now, I'm thinking about, like, do I need to put subtitles on this recording of this presentation? Because maybe someone would prefer to read instead of listen. So yeah, that's a good point. It's just interesting how we have to kind of ask the right questions and kind of hope that what you get from this presentation is that you continue to ask those questions through our work and the process. So this page has some resources. So I definitely recommend checking those out so you can continue asking questions and share with your friends and family. So go ahead and check those out. In about a week or so, I'll upload the link for this presentation, so you'll be able to access the deck here too. And I'm open to any questions if anyone has anything. Myself, Kay, or Ryan, I'm sure we're all happy to answer questions. Okay, well, thank you again for coming and listening to our presentation. Thank you for your time. We really appreciate you all, and thank you for being inclusive.
Bye. Thank you.